Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Liam and today we're going to do a story time. So we're going to talk a little bit about my background and my history with paganism. And if you've seen the title, you might be thinking, well, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but there is some truth in it. And it is something that I do say to people when discussing why I'm so passionate about my practice and why I'm always talking about paganism. So I suppose to start we should probably go as far back as we can, so to give you some background. So I was raised in, I should say, a fairly relaxed Catholic household. So my entire family was Catholic, and I say Catholic, the reason I say relaxed is that it was just kind of, I wouldn't call my family religious. It's kind of something that was done by habit rather than by faith, if that makes any sense. The only person in my family I would say was actually religious was my granddad. However, he wasn't, not in a smothering way. But you know, my mum decided to raise us, me and my sister, in Catholic tradition, and we went to Catholic schools, etc. But I think looking back, I can see that it's not really something that my mum actually ever really followed. She wasn't in any way religious herself. We went to Catholic schools because generally they were considered to be better in terms of education level, and it didn't really rub off very much on either of us, as far as I can tell. Most of my friends who went to the same school either. So that's kind of where my journey with religion begins, though, and you kind of have to sort of give credit where credit is due. I was raised in some kind of religious background, which is probably a help in some ways. And when I try to explain to people why, I feel like it's a little bit complicated to kind of explain it. But I do feel like my background in Catholicism did give me some nuggets of that spirituality that I would continue on into later in life. So I suppose the journey from Catholicism into paganism starts quite simply with the mythology, the stories that all religions have in one way, shape or form. And the stories within Catholicism, Christianity, I always struggled, even as a child, to connect with. So in terms of the practice of Catholic religion, I did and I still do find things such as Catholic Mass incredibly beautiful. The pageantry, I guess, the ritual of it all, the incense and the stained glass windows and the statuary and all that kind of pomp and glamour. I've always admired that within sort of Catholic Mass. But like I say, the stories were always something that I struggled to connect with, and I think the only stories that I did connect with, that I still would connect with, were the stories that I don't think I was meant to, if that makes any sense. I'll try to explain that. So, for instance, I said a little while ago, I think on Instagram, it must have been around Christmas time, but I did say, I made a story basically saying that in my, not Christmas time, I do apologise, it was around Easter time. And what I said in this story was, I didn't think it would be so controversial, but a couple of people messaged me about it. And in my eyes, the story of Jesus is actually the story of Mary. That's how I connected to it anyway. You know, if you think about this young woman who's kind of thrust into divinity, she's had this destiny thrown upon her, and she has to go through, you know, prejudice and persecution, and then she gives birth to the alleged Son of God, and has to stand behind him as he becomes a target of discrimination, prejudice. He made enemies of very, very powerful people, to the point where she's had to stand and watch him be crucified, all the while being told that, you know, he was the savior of mankind and it was worth it. Well, you think, imagine being a mother and standing and watching your child be murdered in front of you and being told, well, it's okay, because that's what he was born to do. Well, you know, if you think about it in those terms, that's a horrific thing for a young woman to go through, and that's what I mean by me not seeing the stories the way that I feel like I was being taught that I should see the stories. So I always kind of had that issue. And then going through, like I say, Catholic schools, I started to wonder what was wrong with, what was the disconnect between some of the things that we were being taught and the things that I actually saw around me in this Catholic environment. I didn't see the love of Christianity in the environment that I was in. The school that I went to was very quite a difficult environment for someone like me. I was always a weird kid. I was different from most of the other kids. As I got older, into my sort of early mid-teens, it became quite clear that I was different. You know, I started exploring my sexuality, and my interests, my sort of music interests, literature interests, all that kind of stuff was very different from a lot of the other kids that I was around. So my experience of Catholic school was a lot of bullying, and a lot of people not practicing what they were preaching. So that was kind of another area of disconnect. And then I started to explore what was going on in the world around me. So I think maybe the third area of disconnect was religious education. Now, as you can imagine, religious education in a religious school is quite a big portion of what we do, or what we were being taught. But I think perhaps being a little bit more analytical for my age than other kids were, I started to question what it was that we were actually being taught. So looking back, it's very clear, and at the time it must have been to some degree, because obviously I diverted away from it. But we were not being taught religious education. That was the wrong word for the lessons that we were being taught. What we were actually being taught is Catholic education. And any other subject that kids are taught is generally taught objectively, right? We objectively study English and we objectively study mathematics. We didn't objectively study religion in my school. What we were actually being fed was, this is the truth of Catholicism, and this is what you must practice, and this is what you must believe. It wasn't until I think year 9, so we were like, what, 13, 14 maybe, that we did, I don't even think it was a full week, I think it was like half a week. We studied Hinduism in an RE lesson. But it was very, to my memory, it was obviously a long time ago, but it was, to my memory, very kind of brushed over. It was like, this is kind of what it is, and that's maybe what some people believe, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't really go into any depth, and it there was no hint of the possibility that it is something that people genuinely could follow. And to my understanding, it was only taught because I believe at the time there was some sort of academic part of the curriculum was that you had to do something about another religion for, you know, a minimum of a certain period of time, which is obviously why we ended up doing it. To me, that's not religious education. Religious education is teaching children that lots of different religions exist and the effects that those religions have had on our society, objectively, and not this is a religion that you should follow and this is why you should follow it and why you shouldn't follow these other religions. Anyway, I digress. So that was another kind of disconnect for me. And when I started looking around at the world around me, I started questioning these things, and I developed a fascination for, at the time, Greek mythology. I discovered these stories, and it must have been in a book somewhere, and I was like, wow, these are they're great stories, of course they are, but the description of the characters in these stories kind of made me start to question things. For instance, you know, there aren't any other stories in Christian mythology where anything is referred to as divine other than obviously Jesus and God. But then I had this other set of stories suddenly where there was this god and this god and that god and that god, and one of my favourite stories still to this day of any mythology is the story of Persephone and Demeter, and I found that fascinating, and I still do, and I understand, you know, again, objectively, it's a story that was probably originally designed to explain something that people at the time couldn't understand, you know, the seasons changing, winter into summer. But I found it, even understanding that, I find it a really beautiful story and a really clever story. So I guess essentially what started happening was I started questioning why this particular story, which is older than that story, is considered to be just mythology, just a story, whereas this story I'm being taught is the truth, and it's something that actually happened, even though there's little to no evidence that it did. And even at such a young age, I was probably 13, 14 at the time, it clicked in my head that actually, no, that is just a story as well. And that's not to say that these stories don't have meaning, and they might have a kernel of truth in them somewhere. But to believe that that story is an account of something that actually happened no longer made sense to me. Take the stories, take the mythology, and try to glean meaning from it. What is this story trying to tell us and teach us? And that's the distinction that started to form in my brain. Now, I can't actually remember the exact moment where I became aware of paganism. How it started, I'm not entirely sure. Like I say, it was a long time ago, but I know I was about 14. And I know that I somehow discovered the existence of Wicca. And I remember being about 15 and convincing my mum to let me buy a book on the subject in, I think it was Waterstones. Do they even exist anymore, Waterstones? Bookshop, a real physical bookshop. And they had this tiny, tiny little mind, body, spirit section is what they called it. And there was seriously like 4 books, I think, on this little section of the shelf. And I can't even remember what the book was now, but I know it wasn't like one of the mainstay, you know, one of the serious books. It was like a shitty little, someone had written it in 5 minutes kind of book. But that is where it started. And from that point on, I slowly started gathering more information. The internet was only just about a thing back then. So I do remember kind of surfing web pages, finding information that, you know, was probably a little bit suspicious. And I remember kind of trying to start my own practice then. Now, would it be till a little bit later where I discovered groups, or a group I should say, in my local area at the time. And I think I found them on some sort of website, which looking back, you know, even now I wouldn't just go meet people that I'd never heard of, never met before, randomly. If I found an advert on a website somewhere, I would never do that, but back then I did. And lucky for me, it worked out all right, because they were a group of young adults. They were, around my age, a little bit older than me. I was probably 16 at the time. And for the first time, I came face to face with real other breathing pagans. And what was nice about this group was that they were all from different backgrounds and traditions. So they didn't all just follow the same pagan tradition. They were druids, there were Wiccans, heathens, and they were what we would do is kind of get together for Sabbats and celebrate Sabbats together. I think I went to that group for about a year or so, maybe a little bit longer, but it really opened my eyes to kind of what was out there in terms of paganism. And then during that time, I started finding more books and doing more research and developing my own practice, and moving very much away from that silly little book on Wicca that I'd discovered as a teenager. And then it sort of progressed from there. So the reason that I say that goddess worship saved my life, hence the title, is we need to go back a little bit again to my teenage years. So, like I say, I was a weird kid. I was very much excluded from a lot of things by other kids. And I was very, very seriously bullied for a lot of my early to mid teenage years, until I left school anyway. And I developed a problem with mental health that would last right up to this moment now. It's not something that just goes away, unfortunately. But probably my darkest time, I was about 15, 16. So we're talking about the time that we're also, as children, being expected to kind of try to decide what it is that we want to do for the rest of our lives, doing exams, GCSEs, and I was in a real bad place. I wasn't going to school. If I could help it, I would try to get out of it, because I just didn't want to be in that environment. There were a couple of my classes that I wasn't even able to attend, because there'd been some sort of agreement with the school that I wouldn't be in those classes because of other children. So I would go and sit in an office somewhere and do my work for those classes instead. I dropped a number of my GCSE subjects because it was basically decided that I wasn't at school enough to be able to pass that many exams. And some of my subjects were sort of downgraded, where you do like more coursework and less exams to kind of make up the difference. So yeah, it was a shit show basically, and I very easily could have ruined my life. But outside of the kind of school part of it, like the thoughts were getting dark, to the point where, I had to go and see a doctor, and my poor mum had to listen to some things that she probably didn't want to hear. I won't go into too much detail, sorry mum. But essentially, if things hadn't have got better, if things hadn't had improved and fairly quickly, there's a very good chance that I wouldn't be sat here. It was that serious, and luckily it did. And it was around about that time, if you line up the timelines, that I had started to develop my practice. And the reason I say goddess worship and not paganism is because a lot of my practice does centre around working with goddesses. I do have affiliations with male deities, but they're not as strong. And I think it boils down to me being that child who saw divinity in the Virgin Mary and her story, and not really connecting with the male characters the way that I was meant to. I would go as far as to say that I can see remnants of goddess worship in the reverence for the Virgin Mary. And when I started to develop into paganism and develop relationships with deities, they just naturally were goddesses, and to this day still are. And I think part of that potentially is I do believe that, to some extent anyway, the way that we connect with deity depends very much on the way that we connect with people and the lives that we have here on the kind of in the physical world. I was raised by strong women, I was surrounded by strong women, I always connected more with women than I did with men. I don't know if that's a kind of a remnant of, you know, women being safe and men not being safe, in terms of how I was treated as a child, but that's always been my way. I've always found it easier to talk to women, so maybe that's another reason why I've kind of translated the physical into the spiritual, perhaps, I don't know. But yeah, the reason I say that goddess worship saved my life is that early practice, and those early experiences of feeling divinity, moments of ritual and meditation where you kind of feel that hand on your shoulder, or that little voice in meditation that gives you an answer to something, or leads you down a journey that eventually leads you to an answer to something. That hand, those voices were always feminine, and they were always various goddesses leading me, speaking to me, talking to me, guiding me. And like I say, without those experiences, I don't think I would have got through the dark times that I had. I don't know if I would say it was exclusively because of those things. Obviously, there were other things happening. I had a very, very supportive mum. I soon after leaving the school environment discovered, well, actually I'm not as weird as people were trying to make me out to be. I'm still weird, but there are other weirdos out there as well, and guess what, the weirdos can all be friends with each other. So I started to understand that things were bigger than I thought they were, and that probably helped a lot as well. But I do still maintain my spiritual experiences played a big part in overcoming that darkness. So yes, I am passionate about my practice, and paganism in general is important to me, because I know the power that my practice has and has had on my life, and by extension the lives of the people around me. And I suppose that's not just a pagan thing, you know, you can find that in other religions as well. But for me specifically, my life would be very different if I hadn't had those experiences. So goddess worship saved my life. And I'd like to know your experiences. So leave a comment down below. How did you find paganism? How did you get to the point in your practice that you are now from where you started? I'm very interested to know. So thank you for watching this video. There is more to my history of paganism. Obviously we only kind of covered the first half of my existence, but we'll probably discuss that in another video, because I did want to try and not let this go on too long. So yes, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please like, and if you are new here and you're not subscribed, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you, bye bye.